Francesca Dego.
I was the first Italian woman to get the finals of Paganini Competition.
He's a leading international violinist.
It's amazing for me that a violin that's over 300 years old is at the top of its game. It was kind of him being a bit vengeful towards violinists. I might have had some doubts about if it was actually doable.
We welcome Francesca as she begins her residency as Ulster Orchestra's Artist in Focus.
I play a beautiful, very antique violin made in 1697 in Cremona by Francesco Ruggeri. The Ruggeri family was one of the four most important cornerstone violin-making families in Cremona. We have Stradivari, Guarneri, Bergonzi, and the Ruggeri family. Francesco, the maker of my violin, is the most important. And this violin was completed a year before he died in 1698. It's amazing for me that a violin that's over 300 years old is at the top of its game, but also the best possible instrument to play a repertoire that was written so long after it was made, that couldn't have been conceived by the actual makers. But these violins are miraculous. And of course, these makers, apart from the fact we know that especially string instruments evolve with time, they need to vibrate in the right hands and the right conditions for many years, some say hundreds of years. And apart from that, the actual maker in himself is usually a genius. So I mean, it's art that makes other art, and I find it absolutely fascinating. It's a bit of a moody instrument, so it doesn't like changes in climate so much, and it needs to get used to where it's playing. I usually try to warm up the instruments a bit in the venue, because being so old, it's wood, and so sometimes if there's a big change in temperature or something, I do feel it kind of going, no, back to bed, please. It's amazing because I think an instrument like that enriches your own way of playing. It has so much to give back. I've been playing this instrument first with other instruments too, and then just this one since 2012. So for a long time. But I think that really the amazing thing about knowing your instrument and getting to play it and know it so well is you go deeper and deeper into the possibilities it has and what it's giving back to you. I've been playing it for now more than half my life. I debuted it when I was 16, and now I'm 34, so that's more than half my life. It is the kind of piece where I can see myself, if I'd been the violinist actually giving the premiere of the piece, I might have had some doubts about, if it was actually doable. So now it's easier in a way because we have so many examples of people actually doing it. On the one hand, I think it has one good part in being exposed and so difficult, which is at least you start right away. I mean, some of the concertos, Brahms and Beethoven, you're standing there for 5 minutes and just kind of getting more and more nervous about it. While at least the Sibelius, you can hopefully gather that concentration backstage, and you have to get into this zone. And the thing is, it really has to have so many elements. It's written expressive, but of course it's suspended in a way. So you have to come through. The sound has to be a real sound. You don't want to be a little mosquito, but on the other hand, it does need to have this whispering, almost like a sunrise over ice. Of course, that's a bit obvious as an image, but that's kind of what it's about. And I think that image, in a way, warms up even more to what this piece is. I just have a feeling there's, of course, this Nordic feel and this incredible energy of nature, of the elements, but a wonderful and very warm passion bubbling the whole time, sometimes under the surface and sometimes in your face, really. Actually, we know Sibelius loved the Mediterranean and spent a lot of time in Italy, actually, also. So he was incredibly inspired by the passionate kind of character of Southern Europe, but of course then saw it through this lens of his own background and personality. The battle he had with his own relationship with the violin and being an instrumentalist is definitely present. It's like he wants to write the most difficult thing that's ever been done. And to some extent he does, because in 1904, the first version that gets premiered is in fact too difficult and too long, he says then himself. And in fact, he cuts some bits of it and didn't want it played after that. In fact, it has only been played a handful of times. And the current version is, let's say, at the limit, but kind of perfect. It just pushes you to the limit, but it is playable. I mean, I've heard various versions of the story about Sibelius and wanting to just kind of overdo his ideal of what could be achieved on the violin. And on the other side, I've also heard it was kind of him being a bit vengeful towards violinists. So at that point, he was mostly playing viola. So writing this fiendishly difficult piece for the violin was a kind of way to get back at violinists and the instrument. I don't know if this is actually historic, but I mean, it's one of those those stories. Actually, funnily enough, I've had the chance to play it with Dalia Stazewska, wonderful Finnish conductor who is married to Sibelius's grandson. To some extent, these people, these composers, they seem so far from us and so untouchable, and then actually they're so human and they're just a few generations back if you think of it. So I think it's very important to never forget that when you're performing a piece, even something as iconic, that you almost worry too much about it. It has so many incrustations of tradition to remember it has been a fresh, just written piece by a very, very clever human being, but still, a person. The first thing goes through all three movements, and it's literally stamina. It's one of the heaviest concertos to perform. One of the reasons is it has the symphonic scope. So it's definitely a very, soloistic piece because it is also a showy and, virtuosic piece. On the other hand, you are part of this texture that is incredibly dense in the orchestra. So the first thing actually happens in all three movements. Usually, if you think of Tchaikovsky concerto, for instance, which is also very heavy, but the second movement is this oasis of peace that is actually, of course, difficult, but much lighter. You never have to, shout in it. The second movement of Sibelius is, on the other hand, just as intense as the other movements. So it's like you don't have one moment in the whole concerto, which is also quite long, of breath from this intensity, which is physical, but also emotional. It is so constantly demanding on sound production and, of course, the technical aspect. But in this case, I'd say more where the bow arm is concerned, because it is literally heavy. Violin, small instrument, we have to make a lot of sound, and that comes from the power in the bow and bow arm. And he uses that, I think, to an extent that only really pieces written in the second half of the 20th century. Before then, there hadn't been anything that really demanded you to scream and cry for 40 minutes. So for me, the first movement is actually about balancing this so it doesn't become overdone, because he incredibly writes so many dynamics and so many diminuendos at the end, for instance, of really high notes that lots of soloists actually forget about often, because you have the instinct of just having a high note and just going for it and making it sound as loud as possible. But he tones this down, as in he's writing this unbelievably intense music, and then he's giving you cues now and then to just, turn it down a notch. And so I think that balance, and I just have the feeling really of waves in the first movement, waves of emotion, and going up to the strongest, the deepest core of our emotions, but also to the lightest kind of superficial calm that you might have before the storm. I think the first movement is, of course, typical first movement of a big concerto. I mean, it's really big. It has an almost unplayable coda, which is the last section before the end of the first movement, which is unbelievably demanding. He uses octaves for the whole time. It's a piece that you can't even practice for a long time. You have to, like, if you're practicing even all day or for a few hours, I find I have to go back to it a few times rather than being able to practice it for, even just like half an hour. The second movement, as I was saying, is this layer and layer of gorgeousness. He has this already in the first movement, and of course, to the maximum in the third movement, this sense of motors going on in the orchestra, rhythmical motors. And so the line seems incredibly free and incredibly non-rhythmical sometimes, but actually you have this kind of heartbeat going on underneath. And that happens in a central part, for instance, of the second movement, which is also very intricate rhythmically. So that's something every violin student who tackles this piece starts trying to figure out right at the beginning. It's like almost impossible. There's one section which is almost impossible to figure out rhythmically. And you're either playing it by ear or you're really trying to analyze, which of course is the right approach, where this fits over the orchestral rhythm. So yes, I think again, the intensity, the soulfulness of the second movement, and the fact it never gives you a moment rest. And then of course comes the last movement, which is, I think, technically one of the most difficult last movements, if not the most difficult actually, in the core repertoire. And there it's like the opposite. It's completely rhythmical. You know, there's a gunshot and everybody starts running and I'll see you at the end kind of thing. And you can literally practice it with the metronome, because it has this relentless feeling in it from the beginning to end. But still you need to balance this spaciousness this kind of writing needs, and the warmth in the sound, because of course this isn't, you know, early romantic or classical music, it's post-romantic. In fact, he has this amazing way of being post-romantic but already incredibly modern. I think that's what makes this piece also very unique. So you're balancing this with the fact you have the orchestra breathing down your neck, this relentless, just the whole time, which is kind of like a race in a way, but it still needs that gravitas, that weight on each note. And of course, he makes it worse by adding a monstrous number of notes, but also double, triple chords. And the polyphony of the violin writing is quite extraordinary. And again, borderline unplayable. It's one of those pieces that I think we're lucky that by this point it has been played so much that you can't say, no, it's unplayable, because of course, you know, it is playable. There's so many recordings that I actually like, and lots of them are very different. Oistrakh is certainly something you want to listen to. It's very different from my approach. It's so incredibly regal in a way, and it's just the base of violin playing, but it's pure. There's something, as always with him, that just has no nonsense about anything, just the depth of the music, and it's overwhelming, and also very difficult to actually recreate, because that's him. What people shouldn't do is, you know, imitate something that is just someone's personality to such an extent. Of the younger generations, the more recent recordings, I love, for instance, Lisa Batiashvili's Sibelius. She plays it a lot. I've heard it live too, and it's certainly one of her go-to pieces, and her recording is really, really wonderful. And so is Ville de Franc, Norwegian soloist, who really, I think, has such imagination. That's what her recording has. Lots of imagination and a lot of this just balancing of the passionate parts, but even more the tonal variety you can have in this piece. In a way, this is one of the most personal works to perform, because it is so based on sound, and sound, of course, for violinists and for any string instrument, and for any instrument, in fact, is your own voice. And so a piece that is based 90% on the sound makes it a piece that is always exciting in different approaches, because it's so varied and so personal. And I've heard so many different recordings, different concerts that are very different from me, but that I still love and never get tired of. And I think that's the key element. I mean, it gives you such a range of possible freedom, even in being so precise in the writing. And I think this is one of the fantastic things that you can really go into and use your creativity. Just never get tired of going deeper into the sound. Every time I go back to it, I'm changing stuff and fingerings and finding new solutions. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why these pieces need to be with you your whole life, because they do evolve, they change, because you change.